Out of 380 soldiers who used flamethrowers on Iwo Jima, only 18 survived and left the island alive. They lived for only 4 minutes on average during battle, but they were called the best weapon and also the worst weapon the U.S. Marines had. Their story is much more terrible than you might think. And now you're going to see why. Why Iwo Jima mattered when people talk about the Pacific War. They usually talk about places like Guadalcanal or Okinawa. But Iwo Jima was a completely different kind of battle. The island is very small, only about 8 square miles. It sits in the middle of the Pacific Ocean between the Mariana Islands and mainland Japan. But in 1945, that tiny piece of volcanic rock became one of the most important places in the entire war. The Americans wanted it because of where it was located. Big bomber planes called B-29s were flying missions from the Mariana Islands to attack targets in Japan. But the route went right over Iwo Jima. That meant Japanese radar and fighter planes based there could see them coming and attack them. Even more importantly, if the U.S. took the island, they could use it as a base for fighter planes to protect the bombers. For emergency landings, and for launching shorter bombing missions that could carry more bombs, the Japanese, of course, knew. All of this, they understood how important Iwo Jima was, and they knew the Americans would try to invade. But instead of fighting at the beach like they had done on other islands, they decided to do something different this time. They studied the previous battles at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, and they learned that defenses on the surface didn't work. Navy guns and airstrikes would destroy most of them before the first soldiers even reached the beach. So this time, they went underground. Japan's underground fortress general Kuribayashi was in charge of defending the island. He was an experienced officer who understood the situation perfectly. He knew he wasn't going to win. He didn't even expect to survive. But his goal was to make the Americans fight hard for every inch of ground and slow down their advance toward Japan. He figured that the longer Iwo Jima held out, the more time Japan had to prepare for the invasion of their home islands. American intelligence estimated no more than 13,000 Japanese defenders were on Iwo Jima. However, they underestimated that number by almost 10,000, and to make matters worse, nearly all of them were dug underground. Over 11 miles of tunnels had been carved through the island's soft volcanic rock, which made digging relatively fast. They built bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and storage areas, all connected through underground pathways. Kuribayashi also had every inch of the island pre-measured. Artillery positions were already aimed at the likely landing beaches and important positions. Firing lanes were set up to overlap and cover one another. There were no front lines in the normal sense, just a network of positions that could support each other from different angles with escape routes below ground. When the U.S. finally launched the invasion on February 19, 1945, they did what they always did. The operation began with days of heavy bombing and airstrikes. Battleships and cruisers pounded the island with everything they had. By the time the first wave of Marines landed, the entire coastline looked like it had been completely leveled. But almost nothing had actually been destroyed as the first wave of Marines hit the shore. They found themselves walking through loose volcanic ash, basically a deep layer of black sand. It pulled in boots, stopped vehicles, and made it nearly impossible to dig in and make cover. However, as waves of Marines were landing on the beaches for nearly an hour, it was all quiet. No gunfire, no resistance. Marines were trying to get organized and move up the slope and inland. But then, just as the beach was packed with men, Kuribayashi gave the order. All at once, machine guns, mortars, and pre-aimed artillery opened deadly accurate fire. The result was devastating. Marines were hit in groups, packed tightly on beaches with no cover. They suffered tremendous losses. But somehow, over the next hours, the Marines pushed inland inch by inch, taking heavy casualties the entire way. And that's when they began to realize just how bad things really were. Flamethrowers entered the fight as they began to understand the defensive maze around them. Bunkers were cleared with grenades and explosive charges, but only one weapon could do the job more effectively. That's when the flamethrower came into play. You see? Every time they thought they had cleared a position with explosives, Marines would move forward, and Japanese troops would reappear and start shooting from behind. They were using the tunnel system to move under the Marines and pop up again in areas that were already supposed to be secured. Losses mounted fast, and fighting was just chaotic without any clear lines. The biggest problem Marines ran into again and again were the pillboxes. These were hardened concrete fortifications with machine guns, small firing slits, and overlapping fields of fire positioned so they protected each other from different angles. Some were so well hidden that you could walk right past them without realizing it, at least not until they opened fire. So to effectively clear them, Marines had to crawl or rush under fire and either toss grenades or explosive charges inside. But that was easier said than done. First, you had to survive long enough to even reach the pillbox. Then you had to find an opening that wasn't covered by gunfire. And even if you got a grenade in, a lot of these pillboxes were built in a zigzag shape so the blast wouldn't reach the whole interior. So just blowing one up didn't always mean the job was done now. The flamethrower became one of the only weapons that could deal with them effectively, but it also came with a heavy price. To understand why using a flamethrower on Iwo Jima was such a nightmare, we need to take a look at how it actually worked. The M2 was the standard flamethrower used by U.S. Marines in World War II and even after. It had two large tanks filled with thickened gasoline and a smaller center tank of compressed nitrogen to push the fuel out. Connected to it was a long metal tube with an electric or white phosphorus ignition system at the tip to light the fuel. But here's the thing. Your effective range was only about 20 yards and a full tank gave you about 7 seconds of fire in total. That meant short controlled bursts, a second or two at a time, and then you were out. You had to somehow get to the pillbox within hand grenade range and use your 7 seconds of fire as best as you could. Then when empty, you had to go back to safety. Now, once the whole front saw your bright and loud fire stream, Japanese defenders knew exactly what a flamethrower would do to them if they let him come close. So the second they spotted a Marine, with a distinctive huge 3-tank backpack moving forward, they gave it undivided attention with whatever weapons they had. The rest of the squad tried to suppress the enemy with rifle and machine gun fire to keep the flamethrower operator alive, long enough to get in range, but with 70 pounds of gear on your back and well-constructed defenses, it was everything but an easy thing to do. Being captured alive was perhaps a bigger fear than being shot, because of their nature of taking someone's life in probably one of the worst possible ways. Flamethrower operators weren't treated like regular prisoners. Execution on the spot, if captured, might be the best option you could hope for, but usually it was something different. Much longer and significantly more painful. There's one story from Iwo Jima, when a flamethrower misfired as the Marine approached the cave entrance. 2 Japanese soldiers rushed out, grabbed him, and pulled him into the cave. The rest of his squad could hear him from that cave for 2 full days, unable to help him or at least end his misery. And we could only imagine what was happening to him. So everything with this weapon was terrible on so many levels. From the extreme danger of the weapon itself. A sudden wind or malfunction could turn it against its operator instead of the enemy. All the way to the psyche of surviving operators who had to live for the rest of their lives with what they did. At that distance, you'd pretty much see, hear, smell the consequences and effects of your weapon on enemy soldiers. While doing research for this video, came upon some photos and videos on the internet showing the aftermath of flamethrowers on Iwo Jima. And if you have a strong gut, you could find them to see what I'm talking about, although I strongly don't recommend it. Sometimes operators used a tactic called a wet burst. They would fire a few quick shots without using the igniter, basically soaking the target with fuel. Then, they'd follow it up with a lit burst to ignite everything at once. It increased the chance of completely neutralizing the bunker without anyone coming back later. In confined space, the stream of flame would immediately raise the temperatures to 2,000 degrees and consume all oxygen. So even if soldiers inside weren't directly hit by the fire, they had a slim chance of surviving looking at a flamethrower. Firing on video gives nowhere near the actual impression of how loud and violent it really is. Even the operators were trained to take a long, deep breath before firing, as they couldn't breathe during the firing. But even with all those risks, flamethrowers were one of the only tools that actually worked on Iwo Jima, still with casualty rates that high. The Marines needed something that could carry that weapon into battle with a bit more protection and more capacity. Flame tanks, and that's when they brought in the tanks. These were M4A3R3 modified Sherman flame tanks. Instead of a main gun, they were fitted with a flamethrower system. They looked like regular Shermans from the outside until they fired. They now carried around 300 gallons of thickened fuel and could fire flames 3 times farther than the M2, up to about 100 yards. These flame tanks operated in coordination with infantry and regular tanks. But the same as with the handheld flamethrowers, once they opened fire, the whole front would concentrate on them. And carrying hundreds of gallons of fuel inside a metal box was not what tankers found interesting to do, as if they didn't already have enough risks. However, flame tanks were definitely the most effective weapon on Iwo Jima and played a major role in capturing the island. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out with subscribing.